Hey, it's Miss D, and we're going to continue our look at the struggle for civil rights among other minority groups in the U.S. We've already looked at African Americans, we've looked at women. Again, my apologies, we're short of time. There's other groups we could also look at, but I'm just going to focus on a few. All right. The first group I'm going to look at is the fight for disability rights. And to give you a sense, I really want to start this off by giving you a feel for the history of what this group of Americans have had to deal with. First, you may not realize it, but from 1860 to into the 1970s, there were actually things known as ugly or idiot laws, where if you had a disability that affected your physical appearance, that made you look anything other than typical, there were laws that could make you hide inside, that you could not appear in public if you were somehow unsightly or disgusting, that if your physical appearance just you weren't pretty enough, you could be hidden inside. In 1927, the Supreme Court said it is perfectly constitutional to take someone with an intellectual disability. So if your IQ was at a certain level, without your permission, you could undergo a surgical sterilization, that the federal government would pay to have you sterilized so that you could no longer have children. And this view of the disabled as just lacking even basic human rights. I mean, everything from the right to control what happens to your own body to whether or not you can go outside. This continues. I mean, the disabled people were routinely locked away in asylums. This was typical, that a child would be born, sent to an asylum, and the parents would. It was perfectly socially acceptable for parents to act like the kid had never existed, never been born, never viewed, and they just lock them away and they forget all about them. To give you an idea, there's actually a movie that came out. It's Rain Man. It won a lot of awards. Big movie in the 80s if you go to look for it. And the plot of the movie was that this guy had memories. His parents died, and he finds out about this guy, Raymond, that he had a brother that he never heard about. He had a brother named Raymond, never heard about it. And he remembers in his head, as a young child, talking to Rain Man. And it ends up he realizes, oh, Rain Man was Raymond. Like when he was really young, he had a brother, but the parents had locked him away in some remote school and just never talked about him. So he grew up, when he was older, he grew up not knowing he had a brother, and just these kind of repressed memories that he just didn't make sense of. So like I said, after his parents die, he finds out about his brother Raymond, and it ends up the brother Raymond had very severe autism. And so as an adult, he meets his brother Raymond and tries to establish a relationship with him. And like I said, the whole plot of the movie hinges on this idea that you would take a kid like that and just lock them away and ignore them, to the point where brothers don't know about brothers and that type of thing. But that was typical, that was normal. And as when we talked about FDR, he was president of the United States. He was one of the most powerful individuals in the world, and yet his physical disability, the fact that he could not walk, was something that he had to hide, that it was something that was shameful, that it was something that needed to be fixed, that the world, was operated in one way, and if you had something that made you other than normal, it was something to be ashamed of, and that you needed to conform to the world. The world didn't owe you anything. You were born broken in some way. And this was a socially acceptable view of human beings and of the world. So basically, you start to see again, I've said this before, that the African American fight for civil rights creates a blueprint that other groups can follow. Just as women followed, so too do disability rights advocates. And their big push is for the right of access to public spaces and public services, just at a very basic level. So, for example, if you had a disability that affected your ability to walk, you couldn't take a public bus. You couldn't take the subway. You had no way to travel. You had no right to get into buildings, even if these buildings were where public services were being offered. They did not have to build ramps or create elevators. Telephones, if you were hard of hearing, you were unable to communicate with people. Because remember, we're talking about into the 60s and 70s. Only recently do we have things like email and text, right? Where if you're deaf, you can still communicate via writing. But, back in the 60s and 70s, telephone was the major communication technology, and it was completely unavailable to people who were either hard of hearing or deaf. And again, even something as simple as going to the bathroom, that you could not access just something so basic for yourself. And of course, it was 100% legal for employers to discriminate, to not hire you just simply on the basis of a disability. So as you can imagine, this alone is going to really hurt the ability of people with any type of disability to be able to live independent lives and to be financially independent. And as I mentioned earlier, state institutions were filled with people that today live in the community. I mean, you guys know, you go to school with kids who have a range of issues, whether it affects their ability to walk or intellectual disabilities or what have you. Today, we take it for granted that we all go to school together and we're one community of just differently abled people, and that's normal. But I'm telling you, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, into the 70s, into the 80s, this was not typical. For example, schools. There was one school that you went to, and it taught classes in one way. And if you couldn't meet these standards, if you couldn't learn that way, then you had to go to a separate school, on a separate school bus, in a separate place, and it was discrimination. It was, the same thing we saw with Plessy versus Ferguson, right? Separate but equal. You could go to school, but you're not going to school with the quote unquote typical kids, right? You have to go to a separate school. You have to be separated from, the quote unquote normal kids. You know what I mean? And this was this belief. This was socially acceptable. And if you had a very severe disability, you would frequently, it was very, very common for parents to lock their kids away in an institution. And many of them, if you had a private institution, it might be good, but they cost a lot of money. So if you were sent to a public institution, a lot of them were very underfunded, overcrowded, and the conditions were very often brutal. One of the worst examples is Willowbrook, and that was right here in New York, in Staten Island. If you look up the video, I'm warning you, it is disturbing. Geraldo Rivera, it got really famous for this, and legitimately so, he deservedly so, for his look at the Willowbrook State Institution. He visited this location in 1972, and the conditions were horrific. Children rocking themselves in straitjackets so they couldn't hurt themselves, just rocking, sitting in their own filth because there was no one there to toilet them or to give them any kind of assistance. Adults, children of all abilities, just left to kind of intellectually rot. There was no education services. There was no vocational services. They weren't learning anything. No one was talking to them. They were just kind of sitting on their own, rocking. As you could see, the one scene that really disturbs me is you see the nurses, the staff there, shoveling food down these kids' throats, like so fast. And it was because they only had like a minute or so with every child to get them fed, that they're shoving the food down their throat to the point where these kids are going to choke on it because they're just racing through. And just to give you an idea, remember, I was born in 1970. So if I had been born with a severe disability, whether physical or intellectual disability, I would have been one of the kids in that crib in the top left. I would have been in there with those other kids. And this would have been the way I would have grown up if I had been born to, if I had been born with a disability. So this is not a long time ago. And again, this was common. And if you want to check out the video, it's available on YouTube, but I warn you, it's disturbing. So again, kind of following that blueprint of the African American civil rights movement, you start to see disability rights advocates getting organized and holding marches and engaging in civil disobedience, like you see on the bottom left, that these people had gotten out of their wheelchair and now they're blocking a public street. They're blocking the buses because they're saying, look, we need access to public transportation. And as I said, being economically disadvantaged and having a hard time finding jobs, having the availability of public buses is going to be critical for them to be able to travel. And as you can see, there's a march, even to the point where using quotes from Martin Luther King Jr., about injustice everywhere, anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and adopting those quotes that were said in the context of the civil rights movement for African Americans and using it in the disabilities rights movement. So in 1968, the Special Olympics was established. The Kennedy family is really involved with that. And it was just this attempt to, again, show that people who were, had some physical challenges, putting them in the public space, giving them an opportunity to be, a positive, seen in a very positive light, and having a chance to, for themselves, having a chance to compete, but also people seeing them, viewing them in a much different way. The first handicap sticker in 1973. And the first piece of legislation that was important was the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And finally, it prohibits discrimination when it comes to federal government programs. So even getting things like aid or, making different job programs available, that the doors were shut to people with disabilities, to American citizens, did not have the same right to get services from the federal government as other citizens. That's crazy. And that doesn't stop till 1973. So again, very much following the model, there was a big push. There was a piece of legislation, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it was under consideration in Congress. So just as we saw with the African American Civil Rights Act, you remember that we saw, the march to Selma and, the march on Washington, right? That these big marches come just as there's legislation being considered, right? The Civil Rights Act and all that. Same idea with disability rights advocates. ADA is under consideration, so they held a very large rally with, a large number of activists. And then what happens is after the rally, a bunch of activists said, all right, we're going to walk the steps of the Capitol. We're going to go up to the Capitol and kind of demand that our senators and, our representatives are going to pass this legislation. One problem, though, there's no ramps. There's no way for people who have a physical disability to even reach the Capitol of their own government to be able to, give voice to their issues. And it was just a kind of, just symbolic of just a lack of access and a lack of respect for American citizens who have some kind of physical disability. So what happens is they have what's called the Capitol Crawl. So these 60 activists got out of their wheelchairs and they did what all people with physical disabilities had to do. If you got to a building and it had stairs, your only option was to get out of your chair and literally pull yourself up step by step using your upper body. Now, obviously, if you have a disability that affects your from the neck down, this isn't even an option for you. But for a lot of people who, have lost the use of their legs, sometimes they're able to, literally, this was a very common thing that they would pull themselves up by their top, and they would have to, a lot of people, and this exists today, by the way, where you'll see people who have to drag up their wheelchair and come up one step at a time. And so they did this. And like I said, one of the most famous participants is this little 8-year-old girl who said she was doing it on behalf of a friend of hers who had already passed away. But this is successful. The movement is successful. And so in 1990, we finally get the ADA, which is a critically important piece of legislation. And again, individuals with disabilities makes up a huge proportion of Americans. As you can see, 57 million people in the United States, or 20% of the population, does have some form of disability. And remember, not just we have people who are born with disabilities, but also people, for example, who get elderly or who get sick or get into an accident where they become disabled later in life. And all of these people now, thanks to the ADA, are no. There's no longer. It makes illegal discrimination in any area of public life. So they are supposed to. People with disabilities are supposed to have equal access to jobs, schools, transportation, public and private places. Now, I will warn you, very similar to what we saw with Brown v. Board of Education, if you remember, African Americans that the Brown v. Board of Education decision was passed by the Supreme Court, but then they actually had to go back to court to demand that the states stop kind of dragging their feet and that they move to integrate schools quicker because they were kind of going at a very slow pace. One of the criticisms of ADA is that, we're already at 2020. And you may not realize, but I mean, yes, if you have, let's say, if you have a wheelchair, thankfully, you can finally take buses, right? That's easy enough. But what happens is a lot of buildings and the New York City subway system in particular, because they were built before 1990, there's still limited access for people in wheelchairs. Many subway stations do not yet have elevators. Many buildings, that were built in the 1800s or 1900s, very old buildings, still they have not found a way to incorporate ramps or different things to get people, to make them accessible for people with wheelchairs. So this is still something that people are fighting. They're saying, listen, you're going really slow. We have to make better progress on this, and putting pressure on states and on the federal government to make this happen a little quicker. But it is positive. I mean, this is the reason why, if you go to the sidewalks, that they finally started having dips in them, and when you go to hit the little button to turn the, if you ever at a street corner and the light is red and you want to make it green, or vice versa, you want to make the light red so you can cross the street, you'll sometimes hear it click, 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 click. That's for people who are deaf, or hard of hearing, that they know what's going on with the light. So it's starting to change, but there's still a ways to go. All right, another really critical piece of legislation, which affects a lot of you directly, is the fact that you now have an IEP, an individual education program. And that is a requirement from the federal government. Like I said, when I was a kid in the 1970s, there were two schools. There's one for typical kids and there's, one for others. And if those don't work for you, well, you're out of luck. But the IDEA, demands that free and appropriate public education is available to all children. And as you can see, this kind of builds on the first Education Act, like I said, in 1975. That was the first time they ever kind of opened the doors to the idea that children with handicaps are entitled to an education. So it starts with 1975, but IDEA is a bigger program. And the idea that every year you have to, double, like part of that is, the fact that you get annually, we have meetings to check on, what types of services should be available, and that, you don't necessarily, that, education has to be tailored to the student. The student is not expected or required to, work within a pre-existing education system. That the education has to be adapted for the student's needs. And it's been amended many times. It'll still be amended, but made a huge, huge difference. The way you guys go to school and the approach to education today, very, very different from the 70s when I was a kid in grammar school. Very, very different.